Hey everyone! For the last lesson of week 2, we're going to be talking a little bit about plate tectonics, or plate tectonics a primer. Before we get into what plate tectonics actually is, let's take a look at what the inside of the Earth looks like. So there are two main schemes of viewing the interior of the Earth. There's the compositional side of things, which really refers to the different chemicals and elements that make up the different layers of the Earth. So this is a rather simplistic form of what the interior of the Earth looks like. We have the core, which is made up of mainly nickel, the mantle, which has things like peridotite and very iron-rich materials, and then the continental and oceanic crust at the surface, which is made of mostly silicate minerals. But the other way of viewing the interior of the Earth is by looking at the mechanical layers, or the way that they physically behave or move. This has further divisions. The inner core is a solid core. It's made of metallic nickel. The outer core is a liquid layer of this. The mesosphere is relatively rigid, while the asthenosphere, which is the tippy top there, that is a little bit more plastic, so it moves. And then finally we end with the lithosphere, or the crust equivalent. Now the lithosphere moves like a solid rigid plate over a plastic layer of material. So what exactly is tectonics? Tectonics is the study of the origin and arrangement of the broad structural features of the Earth's surface, while plate tectonics is actually the theory that the Earth's surface is divided into a few large, thick plates of lithosphere that move slowly across the surface and change in size relative to one another over time. Now let's take a look at a historical perspective of this. There became a group of people that were wondering, do the continents move? And this really developed into two different trains of thoughts. There were the drifters, where the continents changed position over time, or you were part of the fixers, where the continents remained fixed over time and never moved. Now, Alfred Wegener, he came up with the continental drift hypothesis because he observed that the continents appear to fit together, as shown in the image below. Alfred had a few different pieces of evidence for plates moving: detection of continental separation by repeated surveys, congruence of Atlantic shorelines and the similarity of rocks on opposite sides, distribution of similar fossils on opposite sides of the Atlantic, distribution of climate zones in ancient rocks, and finally the bimodal distribution of the elevation of Earth's crust. These suggested a fundamental difference between continental and oceanic crusts, or the two different types of lithosphere. So here's an image demonstrating the first evidence that Wegener had, the continental separation surveys. He measured the movement of Greenland away from Europe, first by using lunar triangulation, and then with more reliable and accurate radio time signals. And we could see that indeed Greenland was beginning to move away from Europe. Rock type and structure was a second type of evidence that Wegener had, and there are distinct rock types on each side of the Atlantic, and they appear to match up. And there are also distinct geologic structures, like the mountain ranges in the Appalachian and British Isles, and those also appear to line up in space. A third piece of evidence was similar fossils. Like modern animals that have specific areas where they live, animals in the past also exhibit similar patterns and behaviors. So when you see a fossil over an entire ocean, you would assume that there was a range. So here on the right are some examples of this. So Mesosaurus is a marine reptile that lived in Africa and South America, very two distant places. Glossopteris is a plant that lived in all southern continents only and no northern continents. Lystrosaurus lived in Africa, Antarctica, and India, and then Cyanognathes lived in Africa and South America. Finally, the climate zones in ancient rocks also seem to match up. So different rock types represent different environments. When you see coal deposits and limestones, those tend to indicate a warm and wet climate, whereas when you see sandstones and salt flats or salt deposits, this typically indicates a drier or more arid environment. You can reconstruct where the paleoequator was by looking at the distribution of warm and wet species to warm and dry species. There was a problem with Alfred Wegener's hypothesis. So he didn't have an accurate mechanism for how the continents would move. And because of this, his hypothesis was not accepted at the time that he proposed it. His mechanism said that tidal forces were actually driving the movement of continents, and this was a very, very weak argument. Now fast forward to 10 years or so, not even 10 years, almost 100 years later, we have this breakthrough. So there's now this plate tectonic theory, or the unifying theory of geology. It's derived from Wegener's continental drift hypothesis, but proposes a new mechanism based on data collected from World War II to the present. So plate tectonic theory, yet again, just to restate, is the theory that the Earth's surface is divided into thick lithospheric plates that slowly move and change in size relative to one another over time. Now, the big deal is this sea-floor spreading hypothesis, and we're going to take a look at how this was discovered together. So on the onset of World War II, a new technology allowed us to look at the ocean floor bathymetry, or the depth of the ocean floor. So what we're looking at here is a bathymetric map, and we're also looking at a reconstruction of what the age of the sea looked like on the seafloor. So also at this time, we were discovering that there's magnetic minerals in the rocks on the ocean floor, and those magnetic minerals can be used to determine the age of the ocean sediments. The red color are younger ocean sediments, whereas the bluer colors are older ocean sediments. Do you notice any patterns? Right off the bat, you might notice that in some areas, there's more red in the center, turning to cooler colors as you move away from the central area, and that it's symmetric on either side. There's also other areas where there's large areas of pretty new sediment and less old sediment, or the old sediment is close to a continent. That is important. Again, here's another map showing the ocean, and we're seeing the depth of the ocean floor here, the bathymetry, and we're also seeing elevation on the continents. What are some observations that you see? For example, right where the sediment was the youngest on the previous map, there's a ridge of higher ground in the ocean, and that ridge is surrounded by lower, deeper sediment on the symmetrically on either side. You might notice large mountain ranges on the edge of continents, such as in North America and South America. You might also notice the thickness of the mountain range above India, the Himalayas. You might notice it's shallower in the northern hemisphere in the ocean than it is in the southern hemisphere. What else can you observe? Here's another map. In this map, we're looking at the location of active volcanoes. When we're defining an active volcano, it's a volcano that's erupted within the last 10,000 years. What kind of patterns can you see in the volcanoes? Is it similar to anything you've seen in the previous maps? For example, in the previous map, where there were large mountain ranges along the coasts of North and South America, there's also a lot of volcanic activity. Another interesting thing to note is the volcanic activity in a ring around the Pacific. And then furthermore, there's volcanic activity located in Africa. So quite a bit of interesting things, as well as some volcanic activity on that central ridge. The last and final map to help us understand plate tectonics is this earthquake map. This map shows you the location of earthquakes and the depth at which that earthquake happened. Again, think about the patterns you're seeing here. how do they compare to the maps that we saw before? Here, you'll notice there's a line of shallow earthquakes in the Atlantic Ocean. That line follows the higher ridge of younger sediment, and it's symmetrical on both sides. Where we had the large mountain ranges and lots of earthquakes, there's quite a few deeper earthquakes happening. And what's interesting is that on the North American West Coast, those are much shallower earthquakes. As you're looking at these maps and I'm kind of guiding you through the observations you should be making, think about how you'll make these observations in similar scenarios when looking at maps on your own on our virtual field trips in the future. What all of these maps have in common is that there's certain amounts of volcanic activity, earthquake activity, and different topography that's associated with plate boundaries. So a plate boundary is where two different lithospheric plates meet. And here is a map showing all of the lithospheric plates that are active today. The mechanism by which we were seeing this happening is seafloor spreading. And it can be explained by looking at those young ridges in the oceans that also have really low earthquake activity and some volcanic activity. What's happening at these mid-ocean ridges is what they're called, is magma is rising up to the Earth's surface. As that magma reaches the ocean, it pushes old dry crust away and replaces it with new crust created and cooled by that magma. As that plate is moving apart, it runs into continental plates. And when it runs into another plate, it either subducts or it thickens the lithosphere. And so this is what produces our plate boundaries. This diagram is a little bit more complex, but on this diagram we can see all of the different types of plate boundaries. Where magma is rising and pushing the plates apart, this is known as a diverging or divergent margin, also known as a mid-ocean ridge. We get low volcanic activity, low earthquake activity, but we have higher ground on either side and younger center in the center. We can also have convergent plate boundaries, or where two plates are converging or coming together. In this image, we're seeing an oceanic plate converge with a continental plate. When that happens, the oceanic plate, which is made of denser material, subducts or is pushed below the less dense layer. So we have volcanic activity in these areas, high mountain ranges, and we also have a lot of deep earthquakes. So that finishes up our mini lecture for today. So remember, as usual, finish reading Top Hat to get a better understanding of plate tectonics, and also answer the associated questions that are there. This is the final lesson for the week, so be sure to check any homework or quiz assignments for the week. And I hope you enjoyed week 2.